Dr. Height, welcome to Explorations in Black Leadership. Thank you for doing this.
Glad to be here.
I want to begin with some questions about Brown versus Board of Education. When you first heard that the Supreme Court had eliminated segregation in schools, what did you think?
Well, I just thought we had hit a new high. I was very excited, and I suppose, like most people, just really rejoiced that reached that point.
When you heard about it, what did you think then it would mean over time?
Well, I really thought it would mean that our schools would be open, that children would be able to go to all schools, would open, doors would be open. I thought it was the end of segregation. That's really what I thought.
And what has it turned out to mean so far as you're concerned?
Well, it's been very disappointing. I grew up in Pennsylvania, and it's where of course, there were no Negro teachers. And I came to appreciate what it meant to be in a classroom with students, and where we were all different races, predominantly children who were foreign born, however, and with a very small group of us who were colored. But I thought that here at last we have something like that, because one of the things that I value is what it meant to me to grow up in a school where I had equal chance, I felt, to do whatever I wanted to do to become something. And that I thought, this is what now we had. It was disappointing to find that immediately there became all of these counter activities, efforts to not only not move forward, but to push us backwards. And I thought that resistance in itself was so disturbing because it confused the picture. And really the action was more like this was about busing and not about school. That it was not about openness, but that it was about trying to give new privilege to people who didn't deserve it. And that I thought was very detrimental, not just to the children and parents who were involved, but I think to the society.
Now, you enjoyed an integrated education.
Yes.
So in that sense, you enjoyed what Brown might have meant.
That's right, and that's what I thought. I thought, well, now because, and until I was an adult, I had never had a Negro teacher. And so my teachers were interested in me. The parents, boys and girls, all shared things together. And I thought, well, this is what school ought to be like. And I thought, at last we had it.
Well, the decision didn't have an effect on your education, but what has it meant to you in the years since '54? How did it affect you?
Well, what it has done for me, it has made me realize that I had to work harder to try to make its objectives realized. I think it has been it gave a new base, however, for working, because at least we had a way of saying segregation and there is no such thing as separate and equal. And I think the elimination of that laid the base for all the work that we could do. Until then, I think we were working hard, but we were really up against something that was impossible because segregation was legal. And I think to take that off gave us a base for really working.
Was this kind of like a stamp of approval of the work you had been doing up to that point and would do afterward?
Yes, it gave you a sense that we're on the right track. And in fact, I grew up, and even in my religious experience, working with people of different religious backgrounds, with the feeling of the importance of openness and how much each one of us contributes to the other, that there's no superior, no inferior.
Now, it's no doubt from reading your biography that your parents, your mother, had an enormous effect on your life.
Yeah.
How did your parents affect you when you were a kid and later on?
Well, I think for one thing, both of my parents were very active in organizations. And I think that's one of the reasons I have understood the value of organization. But I think my mother was especially helpful to me because she helped me to realize, though I was a good student, I could not just strut around and be proud. That she made me understand that I was not in competition with anybody but myself. And so it has made me, I've had all my life a feeling from that appreciation of my responsibility to other people. And I think the other thing is, even in our little community, she helped to prepare me for a world in a country in which there was discrimination. She always said to me, hold yourself together. You take care of you, think your way through. And that to me it's been a very important thing to me. I have never felt the need to push to the head of the crowd, but she helped me to realize that because I was always either first or second in my classes, and she would say to me, you know, what are you doing to help others?
Yes, I remember a story about a boy who couldn't remember his recitation, and you could remember yours.
Yeah. He had only a short speech, and our pastor's wife reported me because she told my mother that I was usually a good girl, but that I laughed all through this program. And I told my mother, I said, here was Herbert. He was trying to make a speech, and he kept saying, he is risen, he is risen. Couldn't remember that it was from the dead, and I thought that was the funniest thing. And so she suggested, and I said, and I have my speech, I had one, a yard long, and I said, and I knew it, and so on. And so she said to me, well, perhaps if that's so funny to you, maybe you don't need to be in it. Well, of course, that was like cutting my throat. And she said, but if you're going to be there, you have to learn. You have to help the others. And you could say, help him with his speech and not laugh at him for what he can't do, but you have to help him. That meant that I turned out to be the official monitor, prompter, and every child would pass their speech to me. And as they went up, I would sit there, and by the time we came to the program, I knew all the speeches. But what it did for me, it let me understand that if you can do yours so much better, and you help him get his done. And that's been a part of my it's even in my bones, I think.
Now, you said a moment ago how important organizations
Yes.
were to you. Did your mother introduce you to organizations, to organized work?
Yes. Well, my father was a choir master in the superintendent school, but he was also a Knights of Pythias and a lot of other things. My mother was very active in the women's club movement. And I was active in little church groups. But then, through the clubs movement, she introduced me. She was president of one of the clubs. And then I was a president of the Emma J. Morris Circle, which was a junior group of that. And so that's how I got active in club work. And it really was very helpful to me because it meant that I traveled about with my mother when she went to clubs and went to organizational meetings, as well as to church gatherings all over.
Give us a picture of what the Black women's organized club movement was like when you were a girl. What were the groups? What did they do?
Well, these were groups that had as their theme, lifting as we climb. And those groups, in fact, there were hundreds of them. Those groups, I always said, often furnished for our community what the white community could take for granted. Everyone had a project of feeding the poor, feeding the hungry, home for homeless girls. You had to have a specific service in the community. And it also was that you had to see what you could do with those who needed it most. And I don't think anyone realizes the way in which those clubs, they sold pies, they baked cakes, they sold chitlin dinners or fried chicken or whatever, but always the money was raised to help someone. They gave baskets at Thanksgiving and things of that sort. But over and above that, they sustained programs. And years later, when I worked in Harlem, and there were Florence Crittenden homes all over the city for white girls, there was not a single bed for a black girl who happened to have been homeless or pregnant and who needed care outside of the Harlem branch of the YWCA and the White House, the White Rose Club. That was a little house that the club women managed, and they kept it. They served girls, they helped girls. I think that was one part of our survival, was the way in which those groups were organized. And I was deep in it.
Now, did this serve as an example for you of how people together
Yes.
accomplish more than one by themselves?
Like working together, you could do so much more. And that also, that different people had different talents. And I used to note that sometimes people who, may not be able to make a speech about it, but I always said they could make a cake that would attract the people to come hear the speech. And there was that kind of way in which everybody had a sense that they had a contribution.
Now, people tell us, scholars tell us, that women, not black or women in particular, women period, are more cooperative and men more competitive. Now, do you find that to be true?
I find that women have what I call a kind of a humane sense. They're concerned about what's going on with children, with the sick, with the elderly, and the like. And they have learned, and they will join hands. They might have their disagreements and whatnot, but when it comes down, I always say women know how to get things done.
Now, how did you become engaged in the kind of work that you do today? I know your history, but what led you in this path? You go to college, you finish, you become almost instantly engaged in this kind of work. Was this a carryover from your youth?
Yes, I often say that before I was 25, really my life was shaped, because I left Pennsylvania to go to college, and while I was in college, I kept searching for a group that I had been very active. I was president of the Pennsylvania Girls Clubs, of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. I was active in my church. I was active in my school. I was active in so many different levels. But I was able to make connection with the Christian youth movement. And then in Harlem, where I lived, I was active with Kenneth Clark and a number of us, Jim Robinson and all. We formed the Harlem Youth Council. I was active with Juanita Jackson at NACP. We formed the United Youth Committee Against Lynching, and so on. So that even during my college days, I was very active in these groups in the 1930s.
So, in a sense, you're recreating the organizational atmosphere that you had left behind in Pennsylvania. Did you find in college that there weren't pre-existing groups that you could join?
Well, you see, when I went to college, you have to bear in mind I went to college in 1929. And when I got there, I found that the groups that were there didn't accept a black person. In fact, some of them, I was even recruited from some when they saw my grades on the wall, but I was turned away when I got there. But the interesting thing happened, and that was at City College, there were students like James Robinson, Kenneth Clark, and at Union there was James Robinson, there was John Morcell also at City College, a group of us at New York University. And what we did, we found each other, and we kind of made our own little group. I belonged to the Ramseys, and another one, each one had a name that represented our African heritage. And we gathered together. We weren't seeing ourselves as a caucus. We were seeing ourselves as needing to find ways to get more understanding of who we were. And so when we had Dr. Du Bois just sit and talk with us, or Langston Hughes, we just felt we'd had the best time in the whole world.
Now, those names you're mentioning, James Robinson and Kenneth Clark and Morcell, these are people who all go on to make a name for themselves in what you generally could call race work.
Right.
Did you feel that your generation was destined to do this, or this was your calling, or?
We felt that we helped each other understand that we were in college, and as tough as it was in the days of the Depression, that we had a responsibility. And to me, it was so exciting to be a part of a group where you had, say, James Robinson, who went on to found Crossroads Africa, or Kenneth Clark, who had a role in Brown versus Board of Education, or John Morcell, who became assistant to Roy Wilkins and ACP, and Juanita Mitchell, and Juanita Jackson, she was there. Mm-hmm. The time that we spent, and we worked at this every week. We had the anti-lynching group one time. We were working another time against chain gang. We had Angelo Herndon come to the city.
Really?
And we had him, and James Robinson wrote a whole worship service around him that we had it at Paul Robeson's Brothers Church. We put on armbands, and with our group called the Harlem, we had the Harlem Youth Council, then we had the Harlem Christian Youth Council, and we would wear armbands when the NAACP would hang out a sign saying a man was lynched today. And all we had to do, we had 88 youth groups, and we would call them and say, a man was lynched today, and therefore we would go down to Times Square, wear our black armbands, and walk around chanting, "Stop the lynching, stop the lynching." We did not let a week go that we did not meet and chart what we were going to do. I was very active and became, at that time, president of the United Christian Youth Movement of North America, which had the slogan, Christian Youth Building a New World. So that you see, we had what I would call the most invigorating kind of experience, and we really worked to feel that we were changing the society.
Now, you say you had Dr. Du Bois speak. Is it fair to say that what you and the others were doing was an extension of Du Bois' dream for the talented 10th?
Yes.
Now, of course, he's talking in all his language about men. And I think it's peculiar to the time that he would reference men only. But you had no worry about being included in that? No,
and there were several. Besides Juanita Jackson, there was Olivia Stokes, there was a number of us. And then Lionel Florent and his wife. And it was also, I have to say, it was at the time of the United Front, because Lionel Florent's wife worked for the Daily Worker, which was a communist newspaper. So that we had these different political interests, but all of us had became more African oriented and more determined to do something about this society, and we believed that we could. Mm-hmm. We worked for the American Youth Act, which didn't pass, but we joined with the American Youth Congress to kind of get that passed.
And so the different political tendencies didn't upset anyone. You were willing to join in a popular front, a common front.
Yeah, it was a day of the United Front. Mm-hmm. And it was a day when I think we said, because we do not absorb each other's philosophies, but we are joined together on one purpose. These are things we're working on. We work to get people to vote. We worked with Adam Clayton Powell to desegregate 125th Street and to open up jobs. We worked with A. Philip Randolph, who would say that you had to learn how to be concerned about what working people. So that I think I learned a lot firsthand about labor relations and about social justice and economic opportunity from the activities we were doing. And that's why I've often said that by the time I was 25, I already had shaped my life's work. I knew where I wanted to go.
Now, we've been talking about the things you did in sort of an extracurricular activity. Was there anything you learned in school, in the classroom, that influenced your life?
Well, I always, I started out with entering the field of medicine, but when I was going to go to Barnard College, and I was rejected there on a quota after I had been accepted.
Yes, they told you they already had two.
Yeah, they had two Negro students, Belle Tobias and Vera Josephs, and so they said I could wait a year and come in when one of them graduated. So I went on to New York University. And so I shifted my interests, and I began to study more I took some work in religion, but also in the social sciences. And one of the things that was valuable to me was that I had assignments to work in communities that were, deprived. And when I say the Depression, I mean that was a time when no one had very much. And I had the opportunity to work in the Brownsville Community Center as a part of my schooling. And I think the other thing I would have to say is that it was in these groups that I belonged to, the United Christian Youth Movement, where we exposed ourselves. We're exposed to people like Harold Lasky and a number of them who had a social philosophy, who were, I guess you would call them in many respects, they were parts of social gospel. So that I was doing one kind of study in the daytime and another one on the weekend and evening in these small groups. Because we didn't just go and meet. We took time, we studied, we read, and even when Kenneth Clark wrote Youth in the Ghetto, some of us were part of his studies of what he was doing right there in the community.
Now, I get the picture that NYU is just ferment of political action of all kinds. Big arguments between Marxists, socialists,
yes,
Democrats, and so on. Is that a fair picture? Just
That's a fair
community
picture.
Just bubbling up with ideas and arguments.
And differences. And you had to learn to know what you stood for. You had to be able to stand up for it. And I found that many a time. And you had people who wanted you to, they were trying to indoctrinate. But I think it was good for me that I had a certain amount of grounding, but also that it wasn't just emotional that we were studying. We knew the difference between dialectic materialism and some other philosophies. And I mean, I just think it was a rich life, though we were poorer in dollars. I think it was rich in that experience. And I often say to young people today who ask me, well, how do we get included? And I say we have to do like Madam Walker did. She said she got started by giving herself a start. And I think you have to give yourself a start by seeing what's going on, what's happening to people. When we saw lynching, when we heard about that, when people like Thurgood Marshall and Walter White and Charles Houston would come into our little groups and tell us things that were happening, we got into action. Nobody had to tell us. That was enough.
You know, you're describing a world which I'm not sure could exist today.
No, it doesn't.
This combination of the place where you were, the depression around you, the ferment in Harlem, agitation against lynching and all these social ills, I don't believe that could occur today.
No, it's a totally different climate. And that's why I have, I find myself finding it hard not to appreciate fully the difference. I say all the time, I don't know what I would do if I were in today's society and 17. the only thing I believe I would do, because of the fact that from my childhood I had an interest in things that were growing about me. As an 11-year-old, I helped to integrate my little community center things, so that I always had a sense of driving to try to make things better. But I don't know, because I go through Harlem now, and I just say, well, this is a very different Harlem from what I grew up in. Harlem, when I grew up in, was poor but rich. There we had Duke Ellington, we had Cy Oliver, we had Lena Horne, we had all the things that were happening. And there was a way in which people felt the need of each other. And there was, I think, in today's society, it's much more individualistic. Young people want to know quickly, what am I going to get out of it? And somehow or other, the conditions under which we were living and our own searching for more meaning to our lives meant that for us it was a matter of saying, what can we do? How can we work together? We were more we-oriented than I see that we are today.
Both more we-oriented, but also, even as a young girl, willing to take a chance.
Yes.
The integrate the community center. Right. Those are signs of leadership. Now, did you think of yourself as a leader when you were doing that, when you were integrating the reading program?
I didn't think of it as a leader, although I found myself usually in any group I was always given some special responsibility. And but I did think in this way that we as a group, our little Harlem group, we saw ourselves as sort of having a responsibility, and we delegated to each other tasks that they were to work on. I worked on domestic workers. Someone else worked on opening up the clinics, because even in Harlem Hospital, we didn't have the things that we needed. So that I think, I didn't think of it as the leader. It was more like, I would say, giving leadership.
But nonetheless, you were clearly a leader at an early age.
Yes.
And have continued on since then. Can you examine how this impulse to lead, where did this come from? Is it your mother's example? Example of others?
My mother's example, my father's example. My father, in addition to being a building contractor and the like, also was a superintendent of the Sunday school and things of that sort. And he and I were always there on time, if no one else. He was what I would say more the manager kind of person who kept stressing and be on time, get yourself properly dressed, do the right thing, et cetera, et cetera. But it was my mother who always helped me to relate to needs in a community and to people. But one thing that I think was valuable to me was that as a child, as a student in high school, and that's why I said it, my teachers were all white, but they saw that I had a potential, and they all cultivated it. They always gave me opportunities. The music teacher let me lead the music when she was itinerant, because she could only be there. She came to us once a month. The other periods of time, I had it. My English teacher, it was she who put me into the impromptu speech contest. And I was relatively shy. I was a good student, but relatively shy. And she worked with me to say that, you have to be able to, you have good thoughts, but many times I would sit in class, and when she would call on me, she said, you have the answer. Well, my mother told me, don't show off. So my teacher would say, speak up. But in between there, it was very helpful to me because she brought me out. And she helped me to learn how to stand up and express myself, think on your feet, and the like. So that I think I have to credit the kind of teachers that I had who showed a real interest, along with my mother's constant, and constantly making me improve. Mm-hmm. I remember I used to bring my report card home, and she would say, "What happened to you? You made 92 last time, you only have 91. And I would say, "Well, that's the best grade in the class." And she would say, "I didn't ask you what the class did. I want to know what Dorothy Height did and what caused you to go back." So, and I remember one time a teacher came to us. He was from the University of Pittsburgh, and he came to our high school. He was our chemistry teacher. And at the end of the semester, he gave me an 89. So I went into him and I said, "Well, I wrote, my mother won't understand this. I cannot take this grade home. I was wondering, what did I fail in or what did I do wrong?" He said, "No, you did very good." He said, "Well, you tell your mother I don't give anyone more than 89. Well, I almost wanted to take him home with me because I knew that my mother would immediately question. But I think also what was helpful to me was that I always had a kind of an inner drive and wanted to go to school, go to college. And I think for me it was helpful that I was able to sign in for an Elks oratorical contest. And my English teacher helped me to prepare. But I think it was that going to the library, studying, it had to be on the Constitution of the United States. And there are many subjects. It could be on slavery in the United States or on the Constitution. I chose the Constitution and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments because after all of my reading, and I was a great reader, after all of my reading, that's what I chose. And it was helpful to me to have the teacher, an Irish Catholic woman, who not only did work with me in school, but she lived down the street from me and she coached me and helped me. But it also helped me, and it's interesting that I say until this day I'm still working on the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. But it was helpful to me to get more than a knowledge of them in a recitation, because it meant that I understood what they meant and what they mean in the Constitution of the United States.
Now, you mentioned the Elks,
Yes.
which had this
It was an Elks
oratorical contest, and have mentioned other groups, the statewide young girls organization, you were the president. What were the other neighborhood networks, groups that impacted you in high school?
Well, I was
and
a
in
joiner.
college?
My mother used to say to me, "Dorothy, if you join anything else, I'm going to take you out of them." I was in the debating society. I was my father being a choir master, I was in a lot of musical groups. With two other girls, we formed a trio. We sang all over to churches and everywhere. I was very active in sports. In basketball, I played basketball.
Playing by boys' rules.
We played boys' rules. I played girls' rules in high school. And in the evenings, I played boys' rules. I loved boys' rules much better than the girls' rules.
Yes, I think people don't know that. What's the difference between boys' rules and girls' rules? I know.
Well, the girls' rules, I was a center, and that meant that the court is marked off, and you play only within that area. There was a kind of assumption in girls' rules that girls were so delicate they couldn't run the full course. So those who were guards had more territory or forward than those who were as centers. And the advantage in boys' rules was that you could just play at it, you could go all the way. I was still center, but I could play the whole court.
Yes, girls couldn't take more than a couple of steps with the ball. Is that
That's right.
my memory? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's very, very limiting, very gentle. And that's why I'm so glad now to see that we've broken away from all that.
Now, in addition to the church providing you with this opportunity to, what did the church in your community, what did it mean to you? In addition to being an organization that you could perform in, that you could participate in, what did it mean?
Well, you see, the church was really the basis in the community. It was through the church that you got the opportunity even speak and so on. But it also meant that we joined with other churches, and I had the opportunity to work not only with my Emmanuel Baptist Church, but with Mount Olivet and with other churches, and we gathered together as in churches. As a matter of fact, my little trio, as we moved about and sang in different churches, we collected new friends, and so we became active. But the thing I also think was characteristic of those days was the quality of caring adults helping you along. I think that was a very important force in my community, that adults in the community felt that they had the right to correct you or to whatever you wished to do. I remember one time I was on my way to represent my school in a contest, and I was about to step on the streetcar, and our pastor's wife called me. She said, "Dorothy Height, where are you going?" At 10:30 in the morning it was. Well, by the time I got off and explained it to her, the car was gone. By the time I got downtown to take the exam, I was too late, and I had to come back the next month, which meant that I had to go back and start preparing all over again. So that, but I would not dare have moved on with her challenging me. I couldn't say, the high school is sending me downtown. I had to tell that to her. And I think it was the quality of attention so many people in the community gave, and so much encouragement. And I think that's something that has driven me today to be concerned about how we try to create a climate, I call it a culture of achievement, a kind of climate in which people expect you to achieve, but they help you.
Now, you're describing what was a fairly common phenomenon
Right.
in black communities then.
That did.
And it's lost
Yes.
for a variety of reasons. How can it be reclaimed? Can it be recreated? Can we create this climate of achievement?
I think we can. I think that we can have high expectations. When I wrote my memoirs, I dedicated it to my mother's high expectations. But if I could have said the high expectations of so many adults. Mm-hmm. You know, you would meet a person like A. Philip Randolph, and he would say to you, well, you have a real potential. You have to do so-and-so. You know, in other words, people took the time not to just assume it, but they took the time to say to you, I hope that you will keep working on this. Or I had an opportunity to be a part of a small group, and they would talk to us about taking responsibility and, you know, standing up on your own, standing up for what you believe in. That, to me, was the heart of it, helping me to see that you had to have your own convictions, that you were not just following along with other people do. And I think that one of the things that we can do today is to take more time with our young people and take some time with helping them understand that they have a potential. It may not always be the same or the same kind, but whatever it is that they can develop, that they can be what they want to be. They can do a lot if they could just get that sense.
But still, you said a moment ago that this today is so different.
So different.
Than when I was young, when you were young. It's just, we live in very different worlds now. The nature of some of the economic problems seem more severe than was true in the Depression.
That's right.
The spread, our communities are so much larger than Rankin was,
yes,
or than even Harlem was.
And I did not grow up in the midst of a drug culture. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's the other thing. So many of the forces in our community now are so overt. The violence, the drugs, all of these are there. But I think that means that it's one of the reasons that we came up in the National Council with the idea of the Black Family Reunion, trying to just lift up values and say, you know, we're not a problem people, we're simply people with problems. And that our young people have to feel that they are not alone in the community and that they don't have to be taken in by everything that tags at them. It is not, however, and I think many think that in my day there were not forces trying to pull you in another way. I think many young people today think, well, you had it easy, but they don't know they were not the same. I think even the lack of funds, the lack of money in the Depression made it very hard and I know some of the young people, even who were in my school, who got caught up in things simply because it was survival. Mm-hmm. So that I think that when I look at myself and realize that I had 25 cents a day to go for my transportation and my lunch back and forth to school in New York City, I look back myself and say, well, how did I really do it? But I did. Mm-hmm. And I think that many young people today think, well, naturally, it was easy for you. No, it wasn't easy. But it was the situation that we felt that drove us to see what we could do about it. It was not just to say, this is not just about me. Something has to be done that changes the situation.
You know, in all that you've said, it seems to me that the biggest difference between then and now is that feeling that I can do something about this. Why is that missing today?
Well, I think we'd have to say some of it is because of the progress we've made. The fact is we do not have legal segregation. And so it's very hard for people to realize what the struggle has been. It is hard for them to even imagine some of the things that we went through even during the period of the 60s. All of that seems ancient now. And many people think that, you know, the civil rights movement was about Martin Luther King having a dream, so that they live in a different climate. They have no connection. And I think that we have failed this generation in not having them keep connected with their own history. Mm-hmm. And I think many have they have practically no patience with what they're doing, but that the advances we have made, the doors that have been opened, they go through the open doors, they don't know how they got open. Mm-hmm. They don't know what the struggle was. That many who could do more now feel more comfortable. You see, I think that in my day, we never got quite comfortable with the situation in which we live. Mm-hmm.
Is there a way you can make people less comfortable? You can cause them to be uncomfortable about today's circumstances? How can you motivate young, older people to have the kind of commitment that you describe your classmates in New York having, drawing this enormously talented group of people together to do good works? Why don't we see that today? How can you make that happen today?
I think it's a leadership issue too. I think that leaders have to bring things within the reach of people, communicate around the issues they understand, not the broad issues of justice, but the small issues of mandatory sentences. I mean, we have to break it down so that they begin to see how the political and social climate in which they live is determining how far they're going to go unless they themselves take hold. If they don't start to do something about it, you know, I mean, I think I think we have a need there to rethink the way we encourage, and that's the way we strive to motivate people. I find that, well, recently I was talking to a group of young people, and they said, well, we never realized that. And I said, well, have you sat still long enough to listen to it? Do you see that we have to, now you have to get in between all the different messages they're getting. Mm. They're getting messages of all kinds, from music, from art, from all these kind of voices, so that and from the media and all. So that I think it means that there's something there that we have to say, leadership today has to be willing to step out on and risk helping to say to young people, this is the way. Have you thought of this way? And do you see this way as degrading and downward? I think we have to do that. Mm. When I was 14, I heard a woman recite that poem about a highway and a low way, and you could choose. And I was 14 years old. I didn't sleep all night.
That was the Pennsylvania State Representative.
Pennsylvania State, a woman who was elected Pennsylvania State Representative. And I thought, well, that is really something she is saying. Mm. And I think that many times young people just need someone and need to be in situations where the leadership dares to speak out the truth, but also speak it out with full respect for the fact that they live in a different day. And you cannot tell them I can't tell them what I did because it's a totally different day. But I can certainly help try to share with them what a difference it made in my life to be able to find myself looking at it now and saying, I learned the difference between having a job or a position or being elected to something or appointed to something, and in having my own purpose, sense of purpose, and my own life's work. I learned the difference in that. But I learned that from the groups in which I effectively worked. And I think many of our young people today are out there on their own trying to do it. They need to be a part of organizations that have purposes, of organizations that have defined goals that are related to their goals, and that can often help them find their goal because the way the goals are stated, and the objectives. And I think that that's a leadership role that is very much needed in our communities, and I think that our young people, I believe, will respond better if we take more of a hand.
Let me shift gears a little bit here. One thing I noted in looking at your life is what seems to me to be a fairly large amount of international travel. Yes. For someone of your time and place. Almost immediately after leaving college, you're yes. overseas. What did these trips mean to you?
Well, it certainly meant to me that when I was 23, I was the vice president of the United Christian Youth Movement of North America. And there was a conference in England. And I was one of the 10 young Americans, 2 of whom were African American, 2 of us, sent to the World Conference of the Churches in England. Well, to be chaperoned and cared for by Dr. Benjamin Mays and his wife, to be exposed to the greatest leaders in all branches of Christendom, to hear Dr. Tawney teach about equality and what equality meant, to lift that out of what I had learned in my other things, even in my oratorical contests, and to have that kind of exposure meant that I had, it gave me an ecumenical experience that has made a difference in my whole life. Mm-hmm. I don't have any problem with dealing with people of difference. In fact, I love it. But I think I learned so much there, and also about issues like war and peace. In the Oxford meetings, I chose the economic order, and so that's where I studied inequality. But when we listened to all the broad speeches, the Reinhold Niebers and Paul Tillich and people like that, it opened up a world to me that I didn't even dream of before. So that to have that kind of experience, and then to return home, that was in August of 1937, and to return home in November 1937, and come to the YWCA, where they had seen me at work in the community and invited me, and there to meet Mary McLeod Bethune and Eleanor Roosevelt, all on the same day, meant to me that I just felt there was a purpose for my life, mm-hmm. and that I had so much that was unusual in experience that I had to feel responsible. And from 1937, for the rest of those two women's lives, they were a great influence in mine.
I want to talk about them in a moment, but first about the YWCA. Now, you go to the YWCA, and when you come, it's focused, as one would think, on women, improving lives for women.
Yeah.
When you leave, it has changed its focus to focus almost exclusively on eliminating racism.
Yes.
Now, excuse me, that's a big jump.
Yeah, when I went in 1944, I was the Secretary for Interracial Education. And I had the experience of 2 years later going to the convention where the issue was before it was really desegregating. And I had Dr. Mays come, and he said to the group, if you have a Christian purpose, and I hear somebody saying the time isn't ripe, then in light of your purpose, it's your job to ripen the time. That was a helpful thing, because what I tried to do was to bring into the YWCA those who could communicate what was necessary. From that action, where the YWCA adopted the interracial charter, with some leaving because they were very unhappy about it, but the commitment began there. And by 1970, having gone through a lot of different things, in a conference at Black Women, we came up saying the YWCA had 7 purposes, 7 objectives as it came into convention: to eliminate poverty, to eliminate war, to eliminate racism, and it went on and on. But the women, in a conference of 500 black women, and that was a risk that I had to take, because even some of the black members said, why are you calling for a segregated meeting? But the 500 women met, and they said, and I did not have this on the agenda when I went into it. After 3 days of looking at it and seeing the role women of color had played, and realizing that they were in an organization which in 1895, when it started with a racial branch, there was not any major group drawn from the large majority population in the country that would have had a black executive and had an institution. So what we'd call advanced then was now something we were ready to give up and to say we will work for the full integration of people. And so we went into the convention and said the YWCA wants to thrust our collective power toward the elimination of racism wherever it exists by any means necessary. Now that for me, let me see the value of being as a staff person, but also taking the leadership and not trying to do it myself, but bringing in people who could help the YWCA, but also to lift up all of those women from the South and all over who strongly said, given our purpose, we cannot tolerate talking about segregation in the society and tolerate it within our own membership. So that's why I have to say that I think organizations like that are very important, but I have to credit the fact, and as I said, if you look at my bio and you see, I entered as the Secretary for Interracial Education. After 33 years, I retired as the Director of the Office of Racial Justice, and that shows you the advances that the YWCA movement made.
Let's talk about Ms. Bethune.
Oh, yes.
When did you meet Ms. Bethune?
Well, in 1937, November the 7th, I was assigned from the Harlem YWCA, I was a new staff, assigned to escort Eleanor Roosevelt into a meeting Mrs. Bethune was holding. And it turned out to be the meeting of the National Council of Negro Women. And after Mrs. Roosevelt spoke, and she was driving her cell phone up to Hyde Park, I took her back to her car. Mrs. Bethune said to me, "What is your name?" She said, and I told her, she said, "Well, we need you." So I've been back ever since. And from that moment, I don't think there was a week for the rest of her life that I did not have some direct contact. She was a mentor, a tutor, a spiritual advisor, everything.
So you met these two women at the same
Same
time.
day.
And what about the relationship with Eleanor Roosevelt?
Well, the next year, 1938, I was one of 10 young people Mrs. Bethune invited to come, Mrs. Roosevelt invited to come to Hyde Park. And we spent the weekend with her at Valkill College, planning for the World Youth Congress. And I became sort of like the chairman of that group. And we worked on how, as American youth, and the conference was held at Vassar College in 1938, how it was we would work with young people coming from all around the world with her as First Lady in hosting this conference and in helping to shape it. But also, this again was a time of the United Front, you have to bear in mind, where you had the communist countries as well coming into this conference. So once again, we had to, figure out who we were and what we were standing for, and had to be prepared to stand up for what we believe. But Mrs. Roosevelt was right there every minute, knitting away sometimes, but always advising. And until her death, she was very close to me.
Something you said a moment ago about Ms. Roosevelt, she was driving herself.
Yes.
I can't imagine Mrs. Bush
It's hard to
driving
believe, but
herself.
there was a time when the wife of the President of the United States would drive her own Thunderbird, park it in a Harlem street for 2 hours, go back and get in her own car by herself. Her only advance that day was Dorothy Height. But she got back in her car and drove on to Hyde Park. There was no Secret Service. There was no advance.
No
Shows you the
policeman.
difference in the climate.
Yes, it is. Now, this relationship with Ms. Bethune leads you into the National Council, which
Yes.
surely you knew about before.
Oh, yes.
Yes,
I'd
and-
heard about it, but it had only been organized 2 years. It was organized in 1935.
But in some ways, it's a result of the early club work.
Yes.
It's a natural.
Yes, Mrs. Bethune had been the 7th president of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. And she said, we do not need another federation of local clubs. What we need is, and she said, the Negro woman, the trained and the untrained alike, stands outside of America's mainstream of opportunity, influence, and power. And what we need is an organization that brings the organizations together. So she founded the National Council of Negro Women as a council of national organizations. We later organized local groups, but those groups are not like a federation. They are chartered by the national body.
And this vision of bringing together these pre-existing organizations, which reached into, I imagine, every community in the United States, was there opposition? Were anyone against this?
Oh, yes. And, some people thought that there were even some people were ugly enough to say, well, Ms. Bethune organized it because she was no longer the president of the Colored Women's Clubs. But as time has gone, here was a woman born in 1875 of slave parents, but she realized that collaboration and cooperation and coalition building would one day be the only way. She also had that kind of vision. And so she organized it as an organization of organizations. And she also picked up the same theme that we had. Colored Women's Club said, lifting as we climb. And Mrs. Bethune said, we need a unity of purpose for a unity of action, to leave no one behind. So that, in a sense, one built on the other.
Dr. Height, let me take you to the 1963 March on Washington. you helped convince the others to let Martin Luther King speak last, but you weren't able to convince them to have a woman speaker.
No, no.
What was the tone
Well,
of
you
that?
know, it was very interesting. Bayard Rustin, who of course was the director for the whole thing, was one we. I went myself. I took a group of women. We had several meetings. But the explanation always was, well, the NAACP, the Urban League, the churches, the labor unions, all of them have women members. Well, we said yes, and we don't want a woman to speak for those organizations. We want a woman to speak for women. Mm-hmm. And they said, well, the women are represented. We weren't able to break through that. There was some reluctance about the Student Nonviolent Committee, but you know, John Lewis was young, and they stood up and they spoke. But in the end, we just said, well, the purpose of this is too great. We don't want to do anything that would cloud that. And we stood back. So the next day after the meeting, we held a meeting called After the March What? And Polly Murray and several people wrote a tremendous document on women in the quest for equality. And I think that to think that the only female voice heard that day was that of Mahalia Jackson, who sang the national anthem. And we said, well, we're the same people who said that in the broad white community, they'll often let us sing, but they won't let us speak. We're doing the same thing. But I think we felt in the end that we did the right thing, but I will tell you, I don't think that would ever happen again.
No, I'm sure it would not happen again. I'm sure it would not happen. Let's talk a bit about Wednesdays in Mississippi. The idea comes from Polly Cowan.
Yes.
How did it come about?
Well, you know, in the summer of '64, Bob Moses set up the Freedom Schools. And when the word got out that he would be having volunteers from all the major Ivy League and other colleges, the word was also out that these were communists going there. And Polly Cowan, whose husband had been in the Hall of Television and the like, was accompanying her husband to England. And she wrote back to me a card on which she said, hearing all these mixed messages about the Freedom Schools, I think it would be very good if we had the Cadillac crowd of interracial teams go into Mississippi on what we could call Wednesdays in Mississippi and do some service, carry our message and the like, and see how we could be helpful and support all these young people who'll be down there working. Well, we developed that idea, and Polly Cowan and I, together, set up a whole plan. We trained our staff. We had to have an interracial staff. But the idea was that we would have interracial teams of women, all of whom had to have some talent. It was not to be as come and see. It was not to be a visit. They were to go in to do something. They had to contribute something in the schools. They also had to commit themselves to preparing on Tuesday, going on Wednesday. We met separately in our racial groups in the daytime, and then we came together in the evening as an interracial group and left on Thursdays. But in the course of all of this, they had to agree that they would go back home and work on civil rights in their own communities.
So they are engaged not only in Mississippi, but have to pledge to do something when they return home. Now, I imagine many of these women probably were already active.
Many were very, very active, but it was really not only to be active, but to carry the true story of what was happening in Mississippi back to their communities. Because, you know, all during that time, it was very hard to get the truth out about what young people were doing, what the whole freedom movement was about. And it was a support system to that group of young people in that movement, but also a base for making connections for people to say, in Minnesota, you may not have exactly the same problem, but there is some aspect of civil rights you could be working on. In your particular community, you can be helpful. But you also have to be able to say what young people are doing to try to bring freedom and how they're working.
Now, was it difficult to recruit the white women who
Well,
went?
we were very selective. We started with some we knew. And then after a while, it was interesting. Women began to call and say they would be interested. In the end, 114 women went down during the summers. They took the risk. Some women, I remember some white women said, I remember one saying, well, if my husband knew that I was in this meeting, he would give me a divorce. She said, but I have to think of my children and my grandchildren. And other women, black women, who, when they came together, said, we have never met together before, but we're never going to separate again. So that we were able to make connections and bring women together.
Now, if it's difficult to recruit the northern white women who went, how difficult was it to recruit the southern Mississippi white women with whom they met?
Yeah, that was very hard. But we were very fortunate. We had an Ann Hewitt, but Pat Darien, who later became in the Carter administration, responsible for human rights. Women, those we call them our anchors. And those women helped us to reach touch with other women. Jane Scott, who was very active in the church women's movement, she drew in others who were there. But it was very interesting how that circle grew and it widened so that you had white women as well as black women. And when they came together, it was an experience that'd be even hard to describe. What it meant when those women came together and shared what they had been doing during the day. It created a new sense of determination. And the New York Times called it, saying that the women had gone behind the cotton curtain. And it was true, because we did it quietly. There was no publicity, but there was an earnestness. And I think the thing that Polly Cowan and I felt all the time was that when we sat down and to do our debriefing, that so many of those women would say, even they had not seen exactly what was happening, the way in which Mississippi law enforcement was treating people, they had never witnessed that before. That when we went into when she and I were traveling, went into Hattiesburg, for example, we were followed by a car. We looked in, as we got into the church, a molotov cocktail came through the window. And naturally, it fizzled. We were glad it did. But a student from Oberlin ran to the organ and played the Hallelujah chorus. And everybody stood and sang it as if we'd all been a chorus. You'd have thought we'd all been trained together. But there was that sense of relief. So that it was not an easy thing that people were doing. They took risks. But there was a sense that we may not be achieving everything, but we felt that there's a nucleus of people there who went on working.
You know, it strikes me this is one of those things that you can't measure.
No.
You don't know what kind of ripple effect it has. And because it was so undercover, there are not that many records of remembrances about this.
No.
And I know Polly Cowan's daughter, Holly Shulman, is trying to recreate some of this, but it's a difficult job.
And I think it's very important because one of the missing elements is the story of women in the civil rights movement. Because even, people often talk about me working with these great men, Roy Wilkins and Whitney Young and A. Philip Randolph, Martin Luther King and all. That's true. That was the leadership strategy kind of group. But behind that, the marches were predominantly women and youth and children. And there were women, so many things that the women were doing that have not been come to notice. And that's why I think it's going to be very significant to have this story now lifted up so that people will be able to see it and hear it and know more about what women were doing.
You know, when you look at the Eyes on the Prize video at the mass meeting crowds, you see immediately that almost everybody in the pulpit is a man.
That's right.
And almost everybody in the
right.
congregation is a woman.
I often saw that. Maybe sometimes I've been to meetings where maybe Mrs. King, Mrs. Abernathy, and I would be on the platform. But the rest of the audience was predominantly women and children.
Yes,
But you know, that when you talk about leadership, I think that's the kind of, role that women often take. I remember doing something in Brooklyn once, and a woman at the end of it said, "We've been talking about volunteer leaders." She said, "What is a volunteer leader?" Now, this woman was running a little home that she was taking care of children and so on, but she hadn't identified it as such. And I think the important thing is that as we identify so many different ways that people take leadership, I think it's more useful to us. Because otherwise you think of elections. And
yes,
so on.
yes. And you think of heads of organizations.
That's right.
And today many more women are, but women play a different role than men.
And I think women also are advancing in public office and the like. But I like to think of leadership, one of the ways I like to think of it is it's the capacity and the willingness to respond to what's needed.
Was it difficult for you to speak out against the nomination of President Bush's nominee, the woman from California, name escapes me? I remember the statements you made at the...
It was difficult because I've worked all my life to advance African American women. But you know, just as I would say, you wouldn't just say my country, right or wrong, it's still your country. I have to say she is still my sister, but she's wrong. And that therefore, there would be no way that I could stand up and say she is the person who should be sitting in one of the most influential courts in the United States.
Let me ask you a question about, in your life, the difference between vision, philosophy, and style. How do these interact for you?
I think vision is a kind of capacity, almost a spiritually based capacity, to see ahead, to be able to envision something that is far-reaching. For example, to envision a world without hunger, but also to have a vision as to how you might achieve that, so that your vision is related to an ultimate goal, something that and it is not something that's just immediately achieved. The other one was
philosophy.
I think your philosophy drives your vision. It is your philosophy is that which you truly believe. Dr. Mays used to say, we often say we believe one thing and do another, and that is not true. Whatever we act on is what we believe. And I think philosophy is the beliefs that drive one. It is that which one wants, what one feels, but one understands, what one is committed to. I think that's your philosophy.
And style.
I think the way you do it is different. People have different styles, and you cannot. And I think often many people have considered a leader one who can, speak loud and so on and so forth. That's a good style for speech, but not necessarily leadership. And that your style also often reflects your philosophy.
I see. Now, what about your vision? Have you had a vision that's guided your work in your life? And has it changed over time?
My vision, the thing to which I have committed my life is broad. I have had a drive, and I think, like they say, the prophets' blood boiled at certain things. Mine boils around the issue of social justice. Social justice, not just for women, but social justice. And for the, sort of the recognition of the dignity of every human being. That is, and I think, as I look back, I think that it has been the same, but with different dimensions as I've gone along.
And what are the dimensions? How did the dimensions enter into this vision or alter this vision in one way or the other?
Well, as a child, I didn't know it was social action, but I acted against being denied the chance to swim in a pool. I reacted against the policies that kept me out of a pool because I was black.
So the vision became more refined?
Yes, it became more, and it got more stimulated in childhood, because I witnessed so much of inequality and so much suffering. When I was a student at New York University, I would walk through during the height of the Depression, men sitting in the yards, in the gardens, with baskets of apples, trying to sell them for a nickel. And every day, that just disturbed me. When I went to India, and I saw so many people just homeless, and I witnessed a woman having a child lying there suffering, then I realized what the depth of poverty means and homelessness and so on. So that everything that I've touched like that has made me work all the harder, made me feel I needed to work that much harder.
It reinforced the vision.
Reinforced the vision that this is not, that we have a world in which there is enough for people to have. There's enough food. There's enough of everything. But somehow or other, we have to find ways to make sure that everyone has their opportunity. Everyone has a chance to develop, to grow.
Let me ask you a three-part question about how leaders are made. A, great people make great events. B, leaders come out of movements. Or C, unpredictable events creates leaders appropriate for the time. Is any of these more true than the others? Are they all true? Where do leaders come from?
Well, I would think that what I said a few moments ago, people who use their talents themselves, and I think, and I stress using themselves because I believe, even as you talked about the style of leadership, I think it is the way people give of themselves and use themselves to respond to what's needed in the situation. And I think that such leaders, for me, have an authenticity. That leaders are not just elected or appointed. I think those are in leadership positions. But I think when you talk about the essence of leadership, someone who has never held an elected position or appointed one, who sees that a stoplight is needed at the corner, carries leadership to save children's lives. I'm saying that I think it is, if you look at it, the essence of leadership. I think we put the label of leader on many people.
Yes.
But I'm talking about leadership is related to one's identifying with something that needs to be done and responding to it and helping to move forward.
Now, think, if you will, about yourself. Are you a leader because your ability to persuade people to follow your vision, or because you're able to articulate an agenda for others to follow? Why are you a leader?
See, I think that you need all three. I think that you need to be able, if you have a vision and you can't share it, and if no one shares your vision, who are you leading?
Right.
So that I think you have to have that capacity and the willingness to try it, to learn it if you don't have it. You can't just go to the back of the room and say, well, let this happen. Right. But I also think that that a role of leadership is to help people clarify their agenda. I often think of Mahatma Gandhi, who said, the people, when they were trying to restrain him, he said, the people here want freedom, and I have to follow them because I'm their leader. In other words, he saw what the need was, but he also helped to frame that agenda. And I don't think you can hope for something to happen without framing the agenda. You have to affect the agenda, and you have to help, but you help not your agenda, but you have to help your agenda be related to the overall social need.
Now, have there been times in your life where you felt a challenge to your philosophy, that you felt that your vision?
All through my life. Yeah, all through my life.
Can you tell us a time?
But, well, I mean, you know, many times. I even think sitting in this building of the times that people said to me, you know, there were times when I almost gave up because so many people said, we don't need something like this. And other people who were antagonistic, as one white man said to me, Ms. Height, why do you need to be on Pennsylvania Avenue for the National Council of Negro Women? You could have a nice office in a side street. But then I knew what his vision was of me and of my people, and his view of me and my people. And so you have them from those who are real opponents and even those who are close in. I think the most important challenge is always to test it back and say, is this something I want? Is this just about me? Or is this really for the good of it? How much is this related to a social goal and not just so I can be the head of whatever it is and sit on that street? Do you see?
Yeah.
So you have to go back and test it that way. But I have to say, often those who challenge you are like President Kennedy told the civil rights team. He said, Bull Connor will prove to be your best friend. Because he helped to make clear what he brought out, that which is subtly hidden all around him. Well, I think sometimes those who challenge you are helpful because they make you have to test to what extent is this vision related to something that is real? Is this thing that I'm trying to do? And it also makes you have to say to yourself that I have to try a new behavior. I have to come another way. I have to see who else is ready to work with this. It makes you, in a sense, it really strengthens leadership if you can survive it.
You talked a moment ago about this meeting of black women you had at the YWCA. What role has race consciousness played in your work and your life?
I grew up, as I said, in a small town, and I was not in, there was no place talking about racial pride and all like that. But from the moment I left home and I left for high school, and even then, in my high school, I began to get a sense of race pride. My mother gave me, for my elementary school graduation, Carter Woodson's book about the Negro history book. And I read that, and I began to feel a pride in who I was. But then, you see, it was reinforced in my school because though we were very few, we graduated for 3 years straight, first, second, and third. So there was no way of having anybody say we were inferior, no matter what, no matter what we did. So that I had that from those early days. But I think one of the values that I found at NYU, joining with other students, was that our focus was always on our heritage, on who we are. And I think that that sense of having deep roots and that were important and significant was always helpful to me. And then, of course, I have to say, I've been in so many situations where I've been the only Negro or the only woman, and I learned to always realize, and people used to say, you're a token. I realized that it's a token who sometimes, by the way you relate, you act, that you can pave the way for others.
Do you see your life as having been centered on advancing race issues, advancing larger societal issues, or do you see them as the same?
I see them as the same because I think that as I advance the racial issue, I advance the society. I think the society now lags behind. And that as I advance racial issues and women's issues, when I look around the world today and realize how in the last 20 years women have come to a new day, I realize that there's, even in our own country, I realize that there's no way to advance, say, the black family without advancing women. There's no way to advance the society and truly advance without advancing, dealing with the issues of race. I think race is so dominant in our society, and racism is so deeply rooted that it's almost inherent that we have to work on the racial issue to bring the society to a better level.
You know, there are many people who would hear you say that and say, you're living in the past. Race was a big issue in the 1960s. It's not an issue at all now. What do you say to those people?
I would say to them, go back and look at your history. What you now have, you have the legal base. You have policy in a broad sense, but you've only just begun. That we have the laws and lack the enforcement. We have the opening, but we lack the economic strength. If you followed all the way through, that we have not had the totality of what I think we thought we were working for.
Dr. Height, do you have a different style of leadership when you're dealing with groups that are black or white or mixed?
I don't have a different style, but I do this. I try to carry, wherever I am, the same message. But I've learned long ago that I don't have to spell out for most black people what the problems are. I have to spell out the direction we're trying to move and the like. But I find that despite all that we have worked on, and you have to bear in mind, I spent 40 years working in an organization that was interracial, but whose membership was predominantly white. And I learned that I gained the respect and appreciation and acceptance of my leadership the more I was the same person that I was everywhere. I never found that compromising on my goals was profitable, was valuable. I always had the same goal. I might adapt the message so that it would get understood. And when I get mail today of women who read about me in a paper and I say, I want you to know how you changed my life. You opened my eyes. And those are predominantly white women. Then I realized that you have to be yourself, and you have to. And people knew that what I was saying. I remember the time that in the Boston Convention, one of the board members came to me and she said, you know, we have been doing so well working on race relations, and now you're talking about racism. And she said, that sounds so terrible, and so forth. And she said, and I said, well, let me put it to you this way. When we were talking about interracial relations, we were talking so much about building bridges between people of different races. We're now past that. I said racism is so deeply embedded in our history, beginning with slavery, that we now have to ask ourselves, why did we need the bridges? We have to look at the underlying cause. And that is because it has nothing to do with your being prejudiced or my being prejudiced. It's in the system in which we live. And I said, and therefore, that's why we have to now call it racism for what it is, and still work on interracial activities. But that should not be a goal. That's just a process. That's just a step. And every time someone says to you, we're building the bridges, we want to make sure we know why they are necessary. I use that as an illustration because I think it's the same message, but I wouldn't have to tell, well, I might have to tell some black women that, but I'm just saying that was the difference because it was painful to think now. We're saying to people, the society is racist. And everyone, they began to say, well, I'm not. And I have to say back to them, you don't have to be. It operates whether you know it or not. The banking system, the housing system, the employment system, everything around you, it operates. It affects me as it affects you. It affects you as it affects me. The difference is you're in a different power position from what I am because you belong to the majority group. So I think that I would say the message has to be the same.
Mm-hmm. Now, does today's society, so different from the world in which I grew up, you grew up, does it demand a different leader today? Do we need a different kind of leader today?
I think you need a leader who is able to utilize all the different new media and things that are available. I think it requires an adaptation, but I don't think we will make it unless we have people who are well-grounded, who have some vision of what the society could be and some real commitment to justice and to equality.
Is there some way that American society can nurture and create the leaders that we need?
I think we have to. And I think we have to begin with our young people. I think we have to offer more opportunity for young people to be exposed to things that will challenge them and that will draw upon the wellspring of values that we know will be intrinsic and important for their development. I think we have to. We have no alternative. In my book, I say I leave this I write it for the future generations because I think they will need it.
What was that great saying that Ms. Bethune used to say, I leave you, how does that go?
In her last will and testament, she said, I leave you love, I leave you faith, I leave you hope. I leave you a respect for the use of power. I leave you the challenge of developing confidence in one another. I leave you the responsibility to our young people. And I always am interested that she didn't say our responsibility for our young people. She said to our young people. And I always feel that our responsibility is to our young people, to help them understand not only who they are and what the struggle has been, but how they are, as she put it, they are the future. But their future doesn't begin later. Their future begins now. And I always like to say to young people, you're not the leaders for tomorrow. You are leaders today, for today. You are youth leaders for today. And what you do as youth leaders will help prepare you to be leaders later in your life.
Dorothy Height, thank you so much for this.
Thank you.